Hello there, everybody. Today I'm going to be going through a list of players in OTP right now that I personally believe are the most undervalued throughout the game. So, just a couple of notes about this list. The first thing I want to cover is what actually defines an undervalued player, since obviously you need to have a baseline of what we're looking for before we can determine what that is. So, the first thing that I want to go through is that a player must have value to be undervalued. So this means that a player, generally speaking, is either a major league caliber player in some respect, a critical depth piece, or a prospect who has major league upside at a realistic point. So I'm not going to be going through players who are AAA depth pieces for the most part that are just ridiculously cheap or anything like that, because there's so many of those that would just be a waste of my time, a waste of your time, and really not that valuable in the first place. The second thing is that the player that we are going through has to be they cannot have their value properly recognized by their team or OTP's engine or whatever it may be. Uh, so essentially, a player can cost absolutely nothing, or they can be really expensive, but even better than their price tag, at which point they are still relatively undervalued. So today, I'm going to be just demonstrating how every player on my list is undervalued. I also want to preface that there are a lot of players, so I'm going to try to keep the pace as fast as I can, and I'm going to try to discuss as many players at once as I possibly can. Anyways, without further ado, let's get started on this list. All right, so I'm going to do this on a team by team basis, and I will talk about some of the best specific kinds of players at the end of the video if you want to skip ahead to that. But anyways, the first team is obviously going to be the Atlanta Braves, and they have a lot of players that I would consider pretty heavily undervalued, really. So, as you can see, we're pretty much in this deal sending one player of any consequential value, Ketel Marte, over and getting what is basically a whole team back, especially on the pitching side. The Braves have a lot of players that are really undervalued. So I'm going to go player by player and explain exactly what makes them undervalued and what their value really is. So first off, Max Fried, who is one of the best starting pitchers in OTP right now. He's affordable. He's he's getting there in his age, but he's still got some team control left. So it's not like he's going to be super expensive. He's got good stamina and hold runners in addition to excellent ratings, especially with a good defense, which of course you're going to be running almost all of the time in OTP. So yeah, he's got really good stuff, movement and control. The movement and control are really the big deal here. If a pitcher's got solid stuff and really good movement and control, they're going to synergize excellently with a good defense. You can count on Max Fried to be a highly effective pitcher a lot of the time. Mike Soroka, definitely a weaker pitcher this year, but he resembles Max Fried in the sense that he's got decent stuff and stronger movement and control. He is a good bottom of the rotation starting pitcher. He's cheap, he's younger, he's got team control left. He pretty much literally costs nothing. Max Fried, I should emphasize here, is expensive. If you were to offer Ketel Marte up for him straight up, it wouldn't quite be enough, but the idea is that Max Fried is just such a good and such a valuable player in OTP that even with his high price, he is still undervalued. Next up is Raisel Iglesias, and this is going to be a recurring theme throughout this video, is these high quality relievers that the game does not value, and that is because of his contract. For 3 years, Iglesias is going to be making $16 million, and while this is a relatively expensive amount, I admit, it is still not that much more than his actual value. He is going to be a force in the back of your bullpen. He is a quality pickup, and he's obviously not worth this money, but the AI thinks that he is worth significantly less. They'll consider him horrible dead money, and they're willing to give you pretty much whatever you want to take on Iglesias. It is kind of ridiculous, and that's part of why this trade, I'm giving up one quality player and getting a large number back, is simply because the AI heavily undervalues guys like Raisel Iglesias and, as you'll see later, Tyler Matzek. Next up is Ronald Acuna Jr., who to me is one of the most perplexing players in OTP to be undervalued. In the past couple of versions, Acuna has been one of the most difficult players in OTP to trade for, period. And this year he's obviously weakened. He has lower power, he's got a little lower contact, his eye is slightly down, his defense is at the worst point it's been to date, but his base stealing is probably slightly down from last year, but he is still one of the better position players in OTP. He's still a 25-year-old on an affordable long-term contract that only goes through his age 30 season. And he is straight up, you can get him for players like Ketel Marte or Alec Thomas, who are certainly quality guys, but not nearly on the same level as Acuna, who I would still have in that upper echelon of OTP talent. Next up, we've got, and of course, as you could probably tell, I think that he is an excellent player overall. He is on the slightly pricier side, but given that he's more of a medium cost player than a high cost player to pick up, which makes him certainly one of the more undervalued players in OTP right now. Next up, we've got Dylan Lee, who is an excellent reliever. He's a lefty. Lefty pitchers are more valuable than righty pitchers. They're slightly better in general, just pound for pound, and they are obviously a little bit more scarce. He has good ratings. He's good against lefties and righties. He's got that slider that I love without being too splitty. He's got high stuff, great, solid movement. I wouldn't call it great exactly, and high control. He's on minor league contracts. He has 6 years of team control, 3 of those in pre-arb for a reliever who is not expensive, but still a high quality reliever. If you compare him side by side to Raisel Iglesias, he's pretty much just +5 stuff. Now, Iglesias is probably on the higher end for these ratings, especially stuff. But you can see comparable talent level, he costs next to nothing to pick up. Very good reliever. Tyler Matzek, essentially what you're getting here is 1 year of team control, or rather, you have another year of team control and then a team option. And at a relatively cheap price. Now, as a reliever, as his talent goes, he is very good versus lefties. He's okay versus righties. He's a solid middle reliever type. He is out for the entire season, but again, at a $1.2 million cost, that's not really going to kill you. So he is a very talented player. But the drawback to Matzek from the Braves' perspective, at least, is that he's dead money. They don't see any value in him. So if you try to trade for Matzek, he comes at a surprising he can add a surprising amount of value to your side of this deal. If you were to add Matzek to say Acuna, you could get Acuna for pretty cheap, and then you're getting a guy who's got the potential at least to be solid as a reliever next year and maybe the year after if you want to pick up that option that's a little bit pricier. But it adds so much value to the trade that it just makes absolutely no sense to not make a trade with the Braves without including Tyler Matzek. Even though Iglesias is on the pricier end to some degree, so if you're a little tighter on money, it might not make sense necessarily to be going for him. But Matzek, he's just so cheap, it always makes sense to trade for him. So he is a solid player, but you're really trading for him because he's not that much negative value in reality, but is treated as much worse in terms of the trade you're making for him. And last up, we've got Huascar Ynoa, who's, again, just really perplexing to me. Now, as a player, Ynoa's not that great. He's probably a reliever, a long reliever even type player. He's got a UCL tear, so he's out for the entire season. He's 25, but he's cheap. He costs literally no money to hold at first, and he doesn't get that expensive. He's got team control left after that. And he comes at literally no cost. You can pretty much get Ynoa completely free, which makes him a very quality player to be worth picking up. So talent level, relatively lower, but he is certainly good value in terms of the price to acquire. All right, next up, we're going to head on to the Diamondbacks. All right, our next team is the Arizona Diamondbacks, and there are more than 10 players, so I have a trade set up here, but I'm going to discuss the players outside of this trade as well. So first up, we got Dominic Fletcher, and this is going to be a recurring theme as well throughout this video. He is a good defensive center fielder, pretty solid actually, with a decent bat. He's 25, he's team controlled. He's not a great player, but if you need a center fielder for cheap, absolutely somebody to be worth looking into. He's certainly a good utility outfielder as well if you want to go down that route with him. But yeah, it's pretty much all about the cost with Fletcher. He's a solid player to be sure, but he's really just quite cheap, and that's his biggest strength. With Nick Ahmed, he's one of the better defensive shortstops in OTP. Now, he's of course dropped off a little bit from his greatest era, but his strength is once again down to cost. He's a lot cheaper to acquire. He's even solid against left-handed pitching at this point than most comparable shortstops. He's got good base running. He's not, as I said, a hole in your lineup. He's not super expensive in terms of how much he costs to pay. So solid player there. Justin Martinez costs next to nothing to trade for, as is common with relief prospects in OTP, although it's a little better this year, and is a very solid relief prospect talent. He's got good stuff, strong movement, developing control. If the velocity continues to improve, his fastball, slider, changeup looks even more dangerous. Very good player overall, and as I mentioned, very inexpensive to acquire. Carson Kelly, solid defensive catcher. He's a captain, I believe, although I'm going to have to enable personalities since I forgot to do that to confirm that. He's a solid hitter as a catcher. He's not super expensive. He is injured, but with him, it once again comes down to cost. With most starting caliber catchers, they are expensive-ish to trade for, but Carson Kelly is not nearly as difficult to get comparatively, probably because of the injury, probably because his statistics over the last season were not the best, but whatever the reason, solid value to acquire. Carlos Vargas, similar to Justin Martinez, who we discussed earlier, is a good quality reliever that you could pick up on the cheaper side. Very high movement, decent control, very high stuff potential with solid stuff at the moment. He's the kind of guy you can slot in as a middle reliever and not think twice about it. Comes at a very low cost to do so. Joe Mantiply, very cheap reliever, very good quality. He's excellent against lefties and still quite good against righties at that. So certainly the type of player that you want to have in your bullpen, almost a must-have at this point. He's cost-controlled to boot. There's a lot to like with Mantiply. Madison Bumgarner, he is obviously a bad pitcher. If you trade for him, you're slotting him at the bottom of your rotation if you're not outright leasing him because he's just not at all good. And I still think he's better at OTP than he is in real life by a pretty significant margin, actually. But anyways, the thing about Bumgarner, he's got 2 years left on his contract. More expensive first year, cheaper-ish second year. But if you have a lot of money on your books for this season, for whatever reason, whatever team you're playing, you make a trade with the Diamondbacks, you get Madison Bumgarner, you can get Corbin Carroll, you can get Zach Gallen, you can get these exciting players for a lot cheaper than if you were just trading for them individually. Alec Thomas, I believe you can get for almost nothing in a deal with Bumgarner because he is just so despised. So he's obviously horrible value, but even less when you're trading for him. He is so heavily undervalued by the Diamondbacks that you're so heavily disliked by the Diamondbacks to an extent that he becomes a liability when they're trading him away because you can just get so much value out of a deal with him. Dylan Ray, starting pitching prospect, very good stuff with velocity that can, of course, improve, although at almost 22, it's unlikely it jumps much. Solid movement, solid control. He's the kind of player that you trade for because he's a good quality prospect that does not cost very much. I'd say middle bottom rotation potential, but obviously decent chance of getting there and a solid prospect overall. AJ Vukovic, another solid prospect from the Diamondbacks. The eye's a little disappointing, but he's got good contact skills with power, gap, and contact. His third base defense is passable. He's a decent base runner. Overall package is pretty solid. He is a little bit on the pricier side to pick up and a little bit less undervalued than a lot of players on this list, but an interesting third base prospect if he fits your uh, goals. Slade Cecconi is a very cheap pitcher, and obviously at 24, he's unlikely to hit his solid potential, but he's already a bottom rotation starter who comes cheap and costs you nothing. If he does happen to develop closer to his potential, then he's a pretty decent bottom rotation starter, so that's really the upside here, the reason that you're trading for him. But obviously, the price is the big draw for Cecconi since he is not an expensive player. Now, there's a couple of guys that was not able to fit into this trade who I would consider undervalued from the Diamondbacks. First of which is going to be Ketel Marte, actually, as I was just dealing him to the Braves. I'm now talking about him with the Braves from the Diamondback, or from the Braves' perspective, rather, of trading for him. Now, the biggest thing with Ketel Marte is the contract. He is not an expensive player, and he plays second base. Not great, but he does play it, which is a position that is relatively weaker, especially this year, especially in OTP, where I would honestly have Ketel Marte as one of the better second basemen from the get-go. He's honestly not that great of a hitter. His contact skills are solid. He gets on base at a decent rate. He's got solid base running, but hey, honestly, it's just his offensive production relative to the position that makes him valuable. He's a middle to lower cost player to acquire and absolutely worth it to do so if you have the luxury of picking him up. Jake McCarthy. I am not a Jake McCarthy fan in real life at all. I believe that last season he overperformed significantly. I expect him to come back down to earth very severely, if that. Um, but I do believe McCarthy is in OTP a relatively valuable player to pick up. I think that he is the kind of guy who can provide you great base running, which is pretty valuable at this point in OTP, solid corner outfield defense, and a decent bat to boot, kind of almost an Alek Thomas level hitting profile. So McCarthy, absolutely a valuable player to pick up. Not expensive. You're really getting him as a decent corner outfielder at a cheap price. Next up is, as I was just mentioning, Alek Thomas, actually going to be Alek Thomas. And for the same reasons as McCarthy, except he's got better defense, slightly better hitting. Base running is a little bit worse, of course, but he does absolutely have a solid potential, and he does not come quite at the price you'd expect for a corner outfielder who can field and hit quite well. So generally a solid value player to pick up, just a little bit better version of McCarthy, essentially. All right, the next couple of players we have are actually undervalued because they are considered horrible contracts, as with, say, Madison Bumgarner. And Zach Davies is going to be first on this list. Now, I think Zach Davies is perfectly fine as a number 5 starter if you need him there. He has a team option that you can buy out for $0 in the next season. It only costs $4.7 million in year one. So if you're making a trade with the D-backs, kind of like how with the Braves, you almost always want Tyler Matzek. You almost always want to include Zach Davies as well because he'll just drop the price of the trade that much. He is absolutely not a good player, but as I said, he does still have the possibility of adding some value to your team and significantly decreases the cost of any trade made with the Diamondbacks. And last on the Diamondbacks list is going to be Mark Melancon, who's kind of similar to Zach Davies. He's okay as a middle reliever in this year if you want. He's got a team option next year. He's more expensive, decreases the value of a trade from their perspective about the same amount, but he's injured, of course, so it's kind of up to preference, but both those guys can be helps to make trades with Diamondbacks a little bit cheaper. And next, we're going to be heading on to the Baltimore Orioles, who have a slightly smaller list comparatively of players that you can get for of good value. All right, with the Baltimore Orioles, there are really only 2 players that I'm going to discuss, although they do have some hitting prospects you can get on the slightly cheaper end. I'm not going to go into them because I don't think they're quite good enough value to discuss in this video, but I'm going to be talking about DL Hall and Keegan Akin. So first, DL Hall. Now you're going to see a lot of, well, not a lot, but a couple of players in this video of a similar build to DL Hall. Very high stuff, solid movement, slightly lower control. So the big draw with DL Hall is, of course, his booming stuff, which is 85 plus. Excellent fastball, slider, curveball, changeup combination. He's 25, so he's team controlled. One of the better prospects in OTP. He is an excellent starting pitcher. Obviously, his stuff's going to be a little lower as a starter, but he's the type of guy who's going to be a good middle to lesser upper rotation starter and doesn't quite cost that much to pick up. Definitely the type of player you want to add in almost every OTP game. He is a little bit pricier, but again, he's just so valuable and so good as a player that it's worth the price to acquire him almost every time. And Keegan Akin, who is pretty much the same build as Hall, but you're trading off a lot of stuff for a little bit more control. He's a much better balanced starting pitcher. He's good in the middle of your rotation as well, probably on the lower end than the higher end. He's also cheap and team controlled. And the big draw with Akin, though, is that he is very inexpensive to acquire. The cost to get DL Hall in this trade was pretty much Ryan Nelson plus Josh Swales. And Ryan Nelson, obviously solid starting pitcher, but in my opinion, not nearly as good as Hall. And then the price to add Akin to the deal was Bryce Jarvis, who's clearly not even close to a decent player comparatively to Akin. Anyways, with that said, we will head on to the next team. Okay, next up we've got the Boston Red Sox. The first player on this roster that we're going to be discussing is Masataka Yoshida. And Yoshida is obviously an international player who came over to the MLB this year, one of their better hitters, and he provides a pretty good bat, ultimately. Very good corner outfield hitter. He is pretty much a left fielder with his defense, but he is passable there. He's viable as a DH. He's viable at first base. And the big thing with him here is the contract, at least from the Red Sox perspective. They consider him overpaid. As contract does go through his age 33 season, he is certainly getting paid more than he's worth. But this really comes back to like those big reliever type contracts. Yes, he's getting paid a little bit more than he's probably worth, at least from OTP standards, but he's still a quality player. This guy is a corner outfielder who can absolutely provide value. He's certainly an above average player overall in left field, and he's absolutely worth paying, just maybe not to this extent, but worth it. So you trade for him and you can get a significant amount of value back. So it comes down absolutely to the cost of acquisition, but he is a decent player overall as well. Next up is Richard Blyer, who is one of the cheapest relievers you can add in OTP. He is a left-handed reliever with high stuff, or not stuff, excuse me, movement and control, decent stuff. Now, the movement and control makes him a very interesting reliever in the same sense as Max Fried. He is capable of being a very successful reliever on a team with a good defense, which, again, you should be running almost all of the time in OTP. So Blyer, very good value pickup. He does cost 3.5, but again, very low, if not negative, cost of acquisition most of the time. And his team option for next year, you can obviously decline if you wish. Next up, we got Tanner Houck, who is relatively cheap as a middle rotation starter. He is really a quite solid pitcher. The stamina, maybe not quite what you'd be looking for, but solid stuff, good movement as well, decent control. Not, I mean, he is splitty, but if you throw him behind an opener, he's going to be pretty successful even such. He is obviously deep and cheap controlled, so very quality acquisition in Houck if you need a guy to fill that middle bottom role in your rotation. Next up, we got Wilber Abreu, who is an interesting prospect. He is 24 almost, so can't really expect too much more room for development, but he is very cheap to acquire. He provides good corner outfield defense. He's already close to a replacement level, maybe a little bit better than that hitter, decent base running. He's the kind of guy you pick up if you need a real cheap corner outfielder and you hope for a little bit better upside, because he does have a chance to become that average to above average hitter, in which case he's a pretty valuable player overall. You got Nathan Hickley, who is one of the better hitters in the Red Sox system, and the big reason that he's on this list is because he's set as a catcher, so the game thinks he's garbage, and I frankly agree as a catcher. But as a hitter, he is pretty good upside. He's pretty much at his ratings. He's already an average or better major league hitter. Um, he hits lefties and righties pretty well as a lefty at bat, and he is, of course, cheap and team controlled. So you move him to first base, you move him maybe even to left field, and he suddenly becomes quite valuable player overall. Costs very little to acquire, very valuable hitter. And this is something I'm going to do with the next player on this list as well. I'm just going to pull up the side-by-side to Tristan Casas, who is a very expensive player, quality first base prospect, no doubt, but a very expensive player to pick up. You can see here that when you're looking at the potential, in terms of power and eye, Hickley actually has a slight edge over Casas. Same with gap power. Yeah, Casas, sure, he's going to hit for a little bit better batting average with better BABIP, but overall, very similar offensive upside in terms of the general value, where Hickley probably actually slightly better hitter with that eye gap advantage versus Houck, but much cheaper to acquire. And obviously with that defensive versatility, I don't believe Houck can play the corner outfield really at all, but Hickley, absolutely you can get away with sticking him in left field if you need a guy there. Next up, we got Nico Cavadas, and once again, I'm just going to pull up side by side with Tristan Casas here. Uh, Another higher batting potential player that just does not cost what you would expect for the hitting upside. Very similarly, he's got the advantage in eye. His gap power is lower, so he's pretty much the exact same bat that we just looked at, but with 10 less gap power. So Casas is probably a better hitter than Cavadas, but it's still a very small gap. Cavadas is clearly a quality hitter who just does not cost very much to pick up. And he can likewise play the outfield, but he's probably not going to. His defense is much more mediocre. He's older, so you're less likely to hit that 5 home run power. But he is, of course, pretty much at his hitting ceiling already. Very little development left to go. So Kavadas is a very safe bet if you need to pick up a first baseman who's cheap and controllable for a very minimal cost. Kavadas, absolutely somebody you want to consider. And last but not least for the Red Sox is Luis Rivello, shortstop prospect. Now, a lot of shortstop prospects at OTP. Defense in general feels a little bit lower this year. It seems like the defensive players aren't quite as strong as they are in previous games from the live starts. So Ravello is actually passable in my mind as a shortstop if you really want him there. If you want to move him to second base, he's great defensively at second base. He's a switch hitter with decent offensive upside. He's slightly below replacement level bat, but that can improve. But really, you're trading for him as a shortstop who costs very little to acquire and provides for you solid defense. These kinds of prospects are almost invaluable, and he is definitely a good player to get. Now, keep in mind that we're adding a lot of quality talent here. We're adding some hitting talent. We're adding a decent corner outfielder, decent pitching, and of course, another decent corner outfielder, and a valuable glove prospect. And we're giving up Slade Ciccone, who's like I said earlier, he's valuable to trade for, but if you can get away with giving him up at a higher value package like this and Ivan Melendez, these are two prospects that are probably not going to hit their potential and not very good players. Anyways, with that said, we will move on to the Chicago White Sox, the next team on the list. All right, for the White Sox, we have a number of interesting players. I just want to emphasize here that with the White Sox, a lot of their undervalued players are undervalued because they have larger contracts and the White Sox don't like them. So if you're trading with them, you're probably making a deal for a bigger player like Dylan Cease, maybe Andrew Vaughn, possibly Luis Robert, something along those lines where you're looking for a bigger player and you're taking on a lot of money to make that happen. So first up, though, we have Christian Mena, who's a very interesting starting pitching prospect from my perspective, and the biggest reason is that he's quite well developed, but he's only 20 years old. Younger pitching prospects who are already very heavily developed, and also keep in mind his velocity is lower, so that could absolutely improve, leading to even more dominant stuff. If you're close to fully developed at a younger age, there's a solid chance that you not only hit your potential but exceed it. As he stands, he's a decent lower middle rotation starter potential. And obviously, the room to grow makes him very intriguing prospect to acquire. We got Garrett Crochet, who is here. And I also want to emphasize, Mane is a little less valuable because he is slightly more expensive to pick up, but he is absolutely a quality pitching prospect to add if you can. Next up, we got Garrett Crochet. Now, Garrett Crochet is no longer a starter. He's recovering from Tommy John. He's 24, so maybe not likely to his full potential. But even as he stands, what you're getting is a solid lefty reliever who pitches quite well. He's cheap. He's cost controlled. He's got team control for a little while going forwards. If he does fully develop, you're looking at a pretty good player. And if he adds just a touch more stamina, he's usable as a starting pitcher. He costs next to nothing to get from the White Sox, so almost a must add in your middle bullpen for a lot of live starts right now. Yasmani Grandal. Now, I've been talking a lot about how catchers are very expensive in terms of their trading acquisition for a lot of the time in OTP. Yasmani Grandal is a quality starting catcher. He's not a great hitter, but his eye holds him up. Eye is very undervalued right now in OTP, which you're going to see as we go throughout this video. But Grandal is probably a league average hitter because of that massive eye. He's got decent catcher defense, and he's a captain. So by all means, Grandal is a valuable player on your team. But the White Sox see is $18 million, which is admittedly expensive for him, just not as much as I think they consider it to be, and they want to get rid of him. So if you can acquire Grandal and say Crochet and Mena, this is a pretty standard, I think, trade package if you need a catcher at the start of an OTP game, because Grandal is just such a valuable pickup. And yeah, it costs you $20 million in year one, but it's going to be very little trade acquisition. You're getting three high quality players in this kind of deal. Next up, we got Lance Lynn. Similar to Grandal, he's getting paid $18 million in a year, and the White Sox think that's too much. Now, Lynn, rather, I'm going to compare him a little bit to Madison Bumgarner. He's similar contract situation. He's obviously not quite as badly undervalued in terms of how much the White Sox want to get rid of him. He's not actually considered that much of a negative at all, really, in most games, and sometimes he's even not, in which case it's really not worth trading for him. But he can be a competent, very good, in fact, lower rotation starting pitcher. And obviously, you can throw him in a deal. So if you need that kind of player, you got the money to spare. and you want to pick up some quality prospects or something at a lower price, you can absolutely make a move for Lynn. Next up, we got Kendall Graveman, who's a pricier relief pitcher. Same kind of deal. He's just undervalued because they want to dump him so bad that they're willing to give up more talent than they probably should to get rid of his contract. Aaron Bummer, I can't remember, to be honest, if he's just very cheap or if the White Sox think he's negative value. I think he's considered a slight negative, but he is a very good lefty reliever. Absolutely dominant against left-handed batters and very good against right-handed batters with great stuff and movement. He's got a very, well, not necessarily very affordable, but a solid contract to be on for a better middle reliever. So again, another decent player whose real appeal is the cost of acquisition. And Sebi Zavala, much on the same tone as Yasmani Grandal, just a very rare, non-expensive catcher acquisition. The defense isn't quite as good as Grandal, of course, but he does bring a solid league average-ish bat and affordability. He's a cheap player, so decent pickup at this point in OTP. And Liam Hendriks, same line as Raisel Iglesias, a dominant reliever, back of the bullpen type guy, excellent stuff, solid control, livable movement, who's just considered bad because of his contract. I mean, really what you do is you just trade for him, you get somebody at a lower value, say Mena, Crochet, someone like that, and you can keep Hendricks. He comes back later in the season, helps you out for your playoff push and in the playoffs. Then you decline his option. I mean, it's just 1 year, $14 million. You're getting a quality player at the end of the season. Absolutely worth picking up. And with that done, we will move on to our next team. All right, we've got the Cubs here and a couple of interesting players to go over. First on this list is Christopher Morel, who's going to be a group or another trend that we're going to see throughout this video. He's got a couple of upsides to him. First thing is the bat, which is average to above average MLB quality. He's got decent base running. He's 24, so he's young, cheap, and controllable. And he's got valuable, versatile defense. He can be a super utility guy. I would probably have him as a starting third baseman or corner outfielder where he's got strongest defense. But he is absolutely valuable pretty much wherever you want to put him, or, of course, in that relatively rare super utility role. Next up, we've got Saya Suzuki, who's kind of in the same uh, boat as Masataka Yoshida. He's a corner outfielder who's absolutely, by all means, a solid player. He's an average to above average hitter across the board, with actually, compared to Yoshida, very solid corner outfield defense, a quality right fielder at that, decent base running. So he's absolutely not worth the money on his contract, but it's not like he's going to be a bad player during that time. And considering the value the Cubs will give you to take him on, absolutely worth having. In a similar vote, we got Marcus Stroman, who is considered much less valuable than I really think he is. He's got that leader personality, so he's valuable from that perspective as well. Higher movement and control starting pitcher with decent stuff, so he's like a lesser Max Fried if you want to think of him that way. Now, yeah, he's making $25 million to 21 next year, but he's got that opt-out, so there's a chance that he doesn't even get that 21 million. And he's absolutely a valuable pitcher in the middle of your rotation, upper middle even of your rotation if needed, for his money, and not that old to boot. So quality pickup if you need that guy in the middle of your rotation and want a little extra value out of a trade. Mark Leiter, very cheap to acquire, solid bottom rotation starting pitcher, very cheap to keep. Pretty much cost of acquisition is the reason he's on this list. Owen Casey, solid corner outfield prospect with good bat across the board, above average hitter, above average fielder. He is 20, almost 21, so as far as age goes, he's very far along in the development cycle, has a very high chance of reaching his potential or even exceeding it. So that kind of player, he's not as expensive to acquire as you might think. Very solid pickup in general throughout the beginning stages of OTP. Now, Pablo Aliendo, I've been talking a lot about the cost of acquisition of catchers because they are pretty cheap, or expensive rather, in OTP right now. Aliendo is a 22-year-old, almost soon to be 22-year-old, almost fully developed bat, which is pretty much average for the catcher position. The defense is the real sticking point here, though. He's a solid ability and arm guy, so quality fielding catcher with a good personality. Overall, a solid player that you can get on the relatively cheaper end for catchers, especially. Chase Strumpf, another third baseman here, who can also flex at second, I suppose, with his training there, and corner outfield if needed. pretty much league average or slightly below that bat, who's very cheap to pick up. So if you need a third baseman or a second baseman or some kind of utility guy or something like that, Strumpf is absolutely somebody you could consider. And last on this list is Ethan Roberts, who's another in a long line of lists of relievers who are significant, or not significantly necessarily, but undervalued by OTP. He's a middle reliever. He's out for the season, yeah, but he's very cheap, costs next to nothing. In the very unlikely, I want to stress, it is very unlikely that he develops being almost 26, having the UCL tear. Um, the fact that he is just everything culminating, he's almost certainly not going to hit his potential. But if he improves towards it, he becomes a very valuable middle reliever. As it is, he's certainly worth picking up as anyways. Anyways, with that said, I believe the Cincinnati Reds are the next team, so we'll head on over to them. All right, we've got the Cincinnati Reds, who are one of the most undervalued teams overall in the OTP world in terms of just the quantity of players that you have available here. First of which is going to be Christian Encarnacion Strand, who is a very quality third baseman, which is a trend that we continue to see throughout OTP, available on the relatively cheaper side. Now, it's definitely the quality over cost of acquisition here. He's already a very solid hitter with the potential to grow into a well above average hitter with average third base defense, solid personality to boot. Next up is Edwin Arroyo, who continues this the trend of shortstop prospects at really good values. Now, he is one of the most intriguing prospects in all of baseball to me because he not only has that solid shortstop second base defense, he's got a good bat, about league average almost even, and he's only 19 years old. He's not even old enough that I can consider him basically 20. He's a switch hitter. Everything is right for Arroyo. He's the kind of prospect that you love to have up the middle, the kind of guy you almost have to trade for early on in your saves because he's just such a good player and not super expensive compared to the quality talent. The possibility of him exceeding his batting potential, just everything is right about Arroyo. Jay Allen the second, he's another player where pretty much everything is right for him as a prospect. The Reds have a lot of these really good prospects right now in OTP. He's a very quality, not necessarily excellent, but quality center field type player. He is kind of on the trend of the players like Fletcher that we saw earlier. He's a 20-year-old. He's got a solid bat that's almost already fully developed. So again, there's the potential that he exceeds it. Good base running, a solid average to above average hitter at a critical position where he's playing average defense with good base running. This is a quality prospect that you can get not nearly at the price that he would be worth, in my opinion. Matt McLain is the kind of guy you pick up if you need a second baseman. And again, second base is a pretty scarce position. He's not expensive. He can play solid defense at the position. He's relatively cheap to acquire, obviously cheap being a young player. He's got corner outfield defense if you want him there. Now, the odds that he hits his potential not great, but if he hits that 50 contact bar, if he somehow develops up to 65 which isn't impossible, him being 24, but not super likely. He's got good base running. He's a quality player overall at a relatively cheap cost at a position of scarcity. Now we got Chase Petty, who is one of the weirder players in OTP to me right now because OTP has a lot of these pitching prospects who are just so heavily undervalued for their talent. Now, this is Chase Petty. I'm going to pull up one of the best pitching prospects in real baseball and in OTP as well, Andrew Painter. We're going to do a side-by-side comparison of the two players, and you're going to see exactly how well Chase Petty pulls out. Now, keep in mind that Andrew Painter and Chase Petty are both very young. They're both 19-year-olds. Chase Petty actually has better stuff potential. Now, Andrew Painter is a four-pitch guy, so I would probably give him a slight edge in terms of strikeout rate. But really, they're very comparable pitchers. Andrew Painter is expensive to trade for. Chase Petty costs very little. He's a medium cost player in terms of where I would place his overall difficulty to get from the Reds, but very, very talented. At 19 years old, he's already got a good amount of development. Now, he's almost 20, so we'll say he's basically a 20-year-old pitcher, but he is very well developed already. He's coming along nicely. He has the potential to be an upper rotation starter and almost always develops into a middle or better. So, absolutely a worthwhile acquisition. And keep in mind, another thing, he's young with lower velocity. That velocity can absolutely go up, and that slider sinker combo is going to look even more dominant with higher velocity to the point where he could potentially even surpass Painter. Next up, we got Michael Ciani, who's one of my favorite players to trade for right now in OTP. Now, he looks a lot like Jay Allen. The big difference here is that Ciani has that elite center field defense that you really want in a prospect. Cost of acquisition is pretty similar. Now, his bat, probably a little less than Jay Allen. He's almost 24. He is, of course, cost controlled as a young prospect. And he's got that good base running, not quite as good as Allen, but again, the defense is just downright excellent. And he still provides decent hitting, although, again, maybe not quite to the extent as Allen or some other guys, but with that top tier defense. So Ciani is an almost must have in every game as your starting center fielder opening day for me at this point. So as you can see, the Reds, a lot of players to trade for. Absolutely one of the better organizations to make a deal with from day one. Daniel Velohin. Now, I've been talking about the cost of acquisition of catchers. He is one of the few exceptions. Livable defense, maybe average-ish point, and solid bat. He is absolutely a decent hitter in your lineup. He's 23, so it's not impossible for him to continue developing towards his overall potential. And he is definitely a decent player to have. So if you're making a deal with the Reds, certainly someone to look into. Rie versus San Martin. Or San Martin, excuse me, as I was corrected a couple days ago for this. A left-handed starting pitcher with decent stuff, decent movement, or a good movement and decent control, and he is very good against lefties while still being solid against righties. You can use him with an opener, or you can just keep him as is. He's the kind of guy who's the type of player you're absolutely looking for, is a cheap, awesome bottom rotation guy. I think he's really more middle rotation quality, but you're picking him up at a replacement level or less starting pitcher cost. He's young and cost controlled. He's absolutely kind of pitcher that you want to have in your organization. Definitely one of my favorite trade acquisitions, as you can see with a lot of the Reds so far. I love making trades with the Reds right now. Nick Senzel, solid corner outfielder. He's got good defense in the corner outfield, or he's a super utility guy, whichever you really prefer. He's got good personality, decent bat and decent base running. He's, of course, got infield defense. He plays second and third, especially third base. So very versatile player. That's really the main center of his value. He's not as young. He's not as team controlled. He's not expensive, but he's not particularly inexpensive either at this point. So he's kind of a particular player for some people, but certainly at least worth looking into for a lot of cases as a utility player at least. Now, similar to earlier Chase Petty, Brandon Williamson, pretty undervalued. Now, he's a different kind of player. He's a lefty starting pitcher. He's almost fully developed. He is almost 25, so the odds of him reaching his potential are not great. You're getting him as he is. He's probably more comparable, actually, to Rie versus San Martin in the fact that he is a very cheap player to pick up and likely to slot into your rotation opening day because he is a quality pitcher from the get-go. If he happens to move into his potential, and he looks even better, but as he stands, a solid player towards the back of your rotation for a relatively low cost. Now with that, we will go ahead and move on to the Cleveland Guardians, who are actually going to be the last team that I do for now. I'm going to split this video up into multiple videos because it's running really long as it is, and there's a lot to cover. I want to be able to go in depth with each player, and I want to make sure that, well, I'm not going super in depth, but I want to make sure that I at least discuss each player to some extent, and I can't do that any faster than I am, so we're just going to make multiple videos out of this. Before I head on, I actually forgot to mention a couple players with the Reds because they just have so many that I wasn't able to fit them all into the trade. First off is Will Benson, who's one of my favorite utility outfielders / corner outfielders to get early on. Above average bat to average to above average bat. He's almost 25, but he is cheap and cost controlled. Decent base running, good corner outfield defense. Costs next to nothing to get another really valuable player to acquire. And if I can find him, Joey Votto, who is a captain. He's actually not a bad first baseman, frankly. I'd say he's below average, but not really bad by any means. Now, his contract is, of course, the reason that you're able to get him so valuably. But he's got a team option for next year. So really you're paying $25 million for 1 year, a captain first baseman who provides some value to your team. And you can get a lot of these players on the Reds who are just very high value for next to nothing if you decide to throw Votto into your trade. And yeah, absolutely, these players are among the more valuable in the entire game right now to trade for. So with that said, we will now actually head on to the Guardians. All right, something I'm going to emphasize here with the Guardians is that there are a couple of teams that, whatever reason, seem to have just generally overall tougher trade difficulties to be making transactions with them than others. And the Guardians are absolutely one of those teams where it's harder to trade with them, but they still have a decent number of players that are undervalued. All of these players are less undervalued. I would say that they're just barely undervalued, and it's really by the Guardian standard. So if you're making a trade with the Guardians, you're probably looking into these guys, but you're not necessarily going out of your way to acquire most of them. There are maybe a couple exceptions who I will discuss when we get there. But generally speaking, these players are not heavily undervalued, and they're just undervalued relative to the Guardians. And they are still absolutely valuable players, but again, you're not really going to go out of your way to get them in most cases. First on the list is Gabriel Arias. He's a 23-year-old infielder. He's getting close to a fully developed bat, which is approximately the average, maybe slightly better. His defense is the big selling point here. He's passable at shortstop, though you're really not going to play him there. He's really more of a third baseman where he provides solid defense, or corner outfielder. So you get him for his flexibility, or you get him for his ability to be an above average third baseman, really. Kind of the Cabrian Hayes type player that you would be getting from last year. Although obviously not quite as adept defensively, pretty much the same kind of archetype. He is a little bit on the pricier end for that type of player, however, and there are usually better alternatives. Next up is Bo Naylor. Cost of acquisitions of catchers is quite interesting because Bo Naylor is pretty much in line with what you'd expect for most undervalued catchers, despite being on the Guardians, where you really wouldn't expect him to be so cheap to get. Now, he is 23, so the possibility of him getting fully developed with the bat is unlikely, but as is, he's still an average to above average hitter. He can absolutely develop into a solidly above average hitter. Defense is not ideal as a catcher, but he is passable, and it's also important to note he is livable at third base. He is livable in left or right field, so he's versatile if you need to move him out of catcher, and a solid player overall. Next up is Joey Cantillo, who's probably the most undervalued player on the Guardians. He is the kind of guy you might actually go out of your way to trade for. He's a solid starting pitcher, can slot into the bottom of your rotation, cheap and controllable, good stuff, decent movement, poor control, which the AI really seems to undervalue. He has the chance to develop more velocity, which would pair very well with his arsenal. Not necessarily his specific arsenal, but with his already higher stuff, getting it even better. So ultimately a solid player to pick up. Now we've got Angel Martinez, who's another kind of player that you might go out of your way to get. He is another third base type. Not as good as Arias defensively, but absolutely better as a hitter. He is an average to above average hitter. Overall, he's a switch hitter, which makes him outperform his statistics generally. He can work as a utility player if you want him for that. He's got a lot of uses. He's a young player who's already pretty well developed as well. And with the higher intelligence, you can't rule out the possibility he overdevelops as well. George Valera, you might also consider making a center of a trade target, but again, the odds that he fully develops, not 100%. There is a chance that he winds up a little less. Now, as a fully developed player, Valera is an awesome guy. He's a solid corner outfielder defensively with a strong bat, and he does not cost that all to acquire. But of course, being mid 22 years old, the probability of him getting fully developed, not 100%. Now, if he is, of course, very solid hitter, absolutely. And even as it is, he's certainly valuable to trade for because he's a solid corner outfielder with decent bat. With his bat at the beginning of games, he's average or so as a hitter. So certainly quality acquisition. Doug, I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name. Bottom of the rotation type starting pitcher that you can get pretty much nothing. He is very cheap, which is unusual in the Guardians organization, but works out probably because of the low control, which obviously the Guardians in real life don't really value either. They like higher control pitchers and tend to develop them very effectively, although Doug, not necessarily one of those, but can absolutely work out well for your franchise if your catcher has good defense, especially. And last on the list is Ordis Valdez. Second baseman, shortstop. He's kind of workable at shortstop. This is pretty much the bottom end of what I would consider viable shortstop defense. At 21, you can't really count on that power developing completely, which is a shame because that was pretty much his only chance at getting up to an average MLB bat. But the defense makes him worth trading for at a relatively low cost of acquisition. Anyways, guys, as I said earlier, I'm going to split this up into multiple videos. I'm going to post them all at the same time, I think, so that you can just go through them one at a time if you want. The last video will be an overview of the best undervalued players. So if you're looking to not watch several hours of content on who's undervalued and you just want to get to the meat of it, you can do that. You can absolutely skip around through videos. I do not blame you for not wanting to watch this much time. But if you want the in-depth explanations, absolutely, by all means, watch the entirety of each video. Anyways, I hope this was helpful for you guys, and I will see you on the next part of this video.